Hey everyone, okay, this is the third and final part of our accident investigation techniques, where we're going to be focusing on event and causal factor charting, and then we will detour a little bit into corrective actions. Okay, so events and causal factor charting, let me go back just a little so we don't distract. It's a specific method of accident investigation that is complex in the sense of it can have all of the other ones we've discussed present in it. There's a lot of variability for event and causal factor charting. That's also partially why it is such a powerful tool, is you can kind of adapt it to the specific characteristics or needs of the situation. So the goal with using this tool is to chart the relationship of events, conditions, changes, barriers, and causal factors on a timeline. ECFC is the most common one. You will see in terms of an acronym of it, because event and causal factor chart is kind of a long one to say. It's incredibly helpful with complex situations, and also the graphical nature of it helps us visualize the relationships in a situation much better. Much better than, say, some of the other methods we've looked at where it might be tabular, like a list or a spreadsheet or something, which have their value. But again, having a visual aid can be super powerful. As you will recall from the psychology section, our visual processing is one of our most powerful tools as humans. Okay, so the heart of the event and causal factor chart is the timeline. So the starting and ending point should be adequate to capture all important information to the situation. So what this means for you, the timeline of the event is not the timeline of the event and causal factor chart. Typically, you will start your chart a bit before the event, and it will continue a bit after the event. So you develop a graphical representation of a sequence of events that led to an adverse consequence. What it will show, when done correctly, is the conditions that affected the consequence, inappropriate actions, if present, causal factors, changes that led to the consequences, and the barriers that should have prevented the consequences. So recall, as we discussed with barrier analysis, that is a hyper-specific analysis tool on the barriers. This won't go in as much depth, but will capture where the barriers should have been in the overall process flow and why they should have prevented the consequence. And then at that point, right, you might find a barrier that then merits a deeper analysis where you would actually execute a barrier analysis. Okay, so this part is super important to kind of understand how they use these symbols, because they are tend to be very specific. As with everything else in this course, refer to your specific domain, because there might be a specific flavor, but these are kind of the main ones that you will see. So square boxes are events, dotted boxes are presumptive events, things that maybe you are trying to corroborate or figure out if they did occur. Similarly, condition is the oval, presumptive condition is a dotted oval. Inappropriate actions are represented by a diamond typically. Failed barriers, it doesn't have to be red brick like here, but it typically is some kind of a broken barrier. Any change, we use the kind of triangle delta type symbol where we capture the before and after. And then your terminal event, so if you have square boxes for just standard events, your terminal event is the round circle. And pause this if you need to just kind of recollect, and I'll try to go back to this a few times. Okay, so when you're developing your events, which are the key kind of foundational piece of your chart, they must describe a single action or happening. They must be described by a short sentence, a single short sentence. Events must be precisely described. They should be quantified when possible, and they must be based on valid information. If we don't have that information, then those events will be dotted until we can validate the information or assumptions within. Okay, so here's an example. Don't worry about a lot of this. This is based on a nuclear reactor vessel head issue, but just to look at kind of how things are structured. These rounded boxes over here are not specifically symbols for that are like that are known as event and causal factor charting symbols, but within here these are kind of assumed or initial assumptions type things, causal factors and the like. So our events are here. We have an inappropriate action here, and then we start to go down here into other things. Now this might look very similar because this is similar to a Y tree. So within the event and causal factor chart, you have your events, and then you start digging into the why did that event occur. And that's kind of how you get down here. And then as you get deep enough, right, we have an RC over here, and then we have a CC. So your reinforcement of principles for a strong nuclear safety culture did not occur on a routine basis is the root cause in this instance. And then over on the right here, we have a contributing cause. Notice where it lines out the barriers here. So that's one way of doing it. I'm going to go through a few different examples that'll show kind of some of the variety. But so again, if you're doing one or reviewing one and it doesn't completely match to this or to the other symbology that we kind of discussed, don't fret too much about those things. There's a lot of different ways to do this. So here's another one, and apologies, a couple of these are fairly bad resolution. And I've went back to try to find better quality versions and have not had a lot of success. I might just need to make my own. So here's another example, right? We have a condition, which is a causal factor. We have secondary event, a primary initiating event. And notice how this has arrows up and down that are called secondary event lines. So the idea, and let's see if we go back here, notice how this initial series is a complete situation here, right? Like it's linear. And then you have this one random offshoot. So when you're doing an event and causal factor chart, you have a primary event line, which is the timeline of primary events, right? Any events that occur above or below that line are secondary events that maybe are contributing, or they're conditions that were brought upon by events. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but keep that in mind, right? So you'll have this kind of initial through line, and then above or below that line is where your secondary events will go. And here's another one here. So we've got events leading to the accident, and then the accident, and then we have post-accident evidence. And some of these little bubbles below, right, we're looking at these would be conditions, as well as some presumptive conditions here. The dotted arrows could mean, again, depends on your own kind of style or what's prescribed in your domain, but dotted lines can also capture a presumption, right? Of we know this condition was present, we believe it's related to this, but maybe it's not validated. Or they could just be, they used a dotted arrow to use a dotted arrow. So again, that's why it's important to stay consistent with whatever the common practice in your domain is. And here's another one. So this is another way of demonstrating this, right? We have event, an inappropriate action, an event, and then the terminal event. And then we have, so if you look at this, this is event E. We have then this consequence of event E. We have a couple inappropriate actions, another event, another inappropriate action, another event. So this terminal event, right, that's this, like I said, your chart will sometimes capture beyond the scope of your initial event timeline, and this kind of captures that. And look at, we've got barriers identified down here, as well as you have procedures that are noted based on where they fit within the sequence. So this is another way of doing that. Okay. And as you look back at kind of all the different methods, right, what's important to realize is they all overlap in certain ways, and to get a really complete picture, you're going to need more than one. So each tool you use is looking at the accident from a different angle, right? Your barrier analysis is looking at the barriers. Your task analysis is looking at the human performance in the specific tasks. The idea is that all the causes will eventually be found and accounted for. And the area of overlap should bring additional insight and information. Typically, you don't use the tools to validate each other. So, how we said, you might have a presumptive condition. You wouldn't necessarily use a barrier analysis to remove that presumption or something like that, right? You typically want facts to be the thing that removes the presumption, but any areas of the overlap should be, again, just to maximize efficiency of these processes, should be always a value added. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go through here. Okay. So now looking at corrective actions. So at the end of all of the techniques we've already discussed, the barriers, the task analysis, everything, once you identify some causes and things, your job's not done. And in some cases, the most important part of the job is still remaining, and that is corrective actions. So corrective actions, the definition, right, are actions which, if taken, would either remove the root cause and make that event impossible to occur again, or they would work to mitigate the event causal factors or impacts. This includes immediate actions, so things that are taken immediately in the state of the event, things like putting equipment into a safe condition, etc. Your initial corrective actions, these aren't immediate, but they can be pretty close to the timeline. And then you'll have long-term corrective actions. Okay, these are kind of your bigger, stickier problems. Think like cultural change and etc. And those are things. And as you're looking at events, you want to keep an eye out for corrective actions, because they're sometimes not as clearly delineated in some of the write-ups or descriptions of what these of the events. But even if you're just looking at like a news reporting of an event, right, you'll start to see like immediate actions and some of those things. So it's important to be able to identify where they kind of live and how they're working. Okay, so when we look at effectiveness, so this isn't exhaustive, right? But this is just to give you some examples of corrective actions that would be more effective or less effective. So more effective, our number one here, right, would be design change fundamentally that reduces the hazard. So some fundamental change in the way this task is performed and designed, or the system it's related to, that's going to be our strongest one. That's also, if you're familiar with the control style terminology, right, that's definitely firmly in like an engineered control type space. Then we might have automatic safety devices, and then safety warnings or alarms, right? We then get into procedures, personnel impacts, so training, knowledge transfer, etc. And then finally, the least effective corrective action is, in this list at least, is to just prescribe hazard identification. That's typically not going to be really great. Training is one of those that you will see a lot of resources thrown at and a lot of effort. Um, and typically it's waste. And that's largely not because of training is bad or, we have a bad system or whatever. It's typically just because you cannot train away the risks around a poorly designed process or task. It doesn't work. Your real solution is to fix the process or task. So, and here's some other ones that kind of degree of dependability, so like degree of effectiveness, right? And where do we go, right? High, we have a reactor vessel shield wall, right? This is a super engineered, validated material that is designed from a law of physics type way to do its job. And then all the way, right, we have self check, supervision, peer checks, right? Things that are going to be less dependable, less reliable, and less consistent. So you'll also hear CAP thrown around a little bit. So a corrective action plan. So what's important with corrective action plans fundamentally is to make sure they are effective. So there always has to be a clear link between a cause and a corrective action. There can be multiple corrective actions for a cause, but every corrective action has to map to a cause. You want to watch for unintended consequences, especially as you impact existing processes, right? You may actually solve the problem that the event was related to, and in so doing may introduce an entirely new problem. You want to include the goal of the action within the action's text. This is incredibly important to make sure that that goal is consistently in the mind of everybody who interacts with it. You document completed corrective actions, develop interim or immediate corrective actions, and consider the risk to repeat recurrence during the completion of the overall action plan. Now, one thing to note is a fairly significant obstacle or gap in a lot of industrial settings is we typically do not do a great job as organizations at testing and validating our corrective actions. So we put in these corrective actions and then we don't ever test them. For example, maybe you have some equipment, some instrumentation, and it's got some buttons or switches that are present on like a wall, and somebody can bump them accidentally. So your solution is, okay, we're going to put a plastic cover over the button so that it can't be hit accidentally. Good corrective action, good engineered control. But if you never actually test it by tossing somebody into it or bumping it on purpose, it's hard to know if it will work. And that's one thing that we don't do a great job of generally. And typically that's because, right, the risk of a recurrence of the event if it doesn't work is significant, or there's just not a lot of operational appetite to potentially break something again, right? But the unfortunate thing is without testing and evaluating the corrective action's efficacy, the only way you know if it was effective or not is if you end up in an event space again down the road, which is literally the worst possible result. So that is definitely one of those things that you may run into where corrective action plans get put into place with very little testing or validation after the fact. And that isn't okay. It's not effective, but it's also something to be aware of that is very common. And some of these events, right, we can't simulate or create again. So testing corrective actions in that domain is kind of tricky, especially if you look into kind of the coordinated response after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. The coordinated worldwide response about how to mitigate the issues that were present at TMI is kind of the next best alternative. So if you can't create another instance like this, then you create a robust corrective action plan with validation that typically occurs over years, right? And testing in structured safety settings and things to make sure those things are working still. But yeah, just be aware. Again, the only way to ensure that your corrective action will work is to test it. Okay, so you'll hear SMART corrective actions, sometimes SMARTs. The last S is kind of optional. I've seen it both ways. So your corrective actions have to meet these characteristics. They have to be specific, they have to be measurable, achievable, realistic, timely, and sustainable. And hopefully all those kind of make sense, right? And we'll go into the opposite side of these in a bit, but these are kind of the overall goals that you want to look at. And keep in mind, when we say specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely, all these things, that's not really in your opinion. Because especially as an event investigator, you're probably not doing this job like daily. You probably got brought in, or maybe you do this kind of as like a side duty of your standard job. But the idea of something being measurable, achievable, realistic, that's in the eye and the perception of the people who actually have to do these things. So that's also why it's super important to do even just some like initial testing with specific users of this corrective action to make sure it's gonna actually work and not just be something that they can't implement for whatever reason, right? And so you really have to pull that thread. Okay, so specific, we're gonna go through kind of each of these so you have a really good kind of understanding of what we mean. So a specific corrective action, the level of detail should be such that the individual who is assigned to carry out the action can understand the reason for the action and each step, task, or action required to effectively implement the action. So the level of detail is directly based on knowledge level of the target audience. That means it should never be overly technical. It is not written for SMEs or system experts or process experts. It is written for people doing a job. It should be short, concise, self-explanatory, and free of any words or phrases that could imply a double meaning. If you're trying to kind of interrogate your own corrective actions, right? Adopt throw on your Law and Order hat, and can you twist this to mean something else? And if so, you need to keep iterating to get it clearer. Okay, measurable. The desired outcome or behavior should be clearly described in such a way that it can be seen physically or the physical outcome is obvious. So this can be, and not obvious like the common sense folk psychology stuff. No, the button is now red because the corrective action was make the button red. We did that and observed it is in fact red, right? Those are kind of the things we're looking at. And then going in quickly to achievable and realistic. Achievable within the organization's responsibility, resources, and the qualifications to perform, right? We don't want to prescribe a corrective action in an organization that literally only like Congress can take that action or something, right? We want to make sure it's achievable. Realistic should be compatible with the organization's goals, values, and strategy. Now be aware, in some instances, hopefully you never find yourself in this position, but it does happen where the organization's goals, values, and strategy are not aligned with safety and ethics and integrity, and that's a different problem, right? But realistic is intended to capture that the change you're prescribing is within the organization's overall kind of appetite to process and handle. Timely, so actions need to have a specific time frame for completion that is realistic for the task to be done, the resources available, and commensurate with the significance of the problem being fixed. Now, the only exception to the specific timeline thing is if it's a long-term corrective action. And those still should have a timeline, but it just may be much longer. But again, your corrective action should say, button must be painted red by blank day, right? And those steps need to be taken. And you work with operations, you validate that what you're asking for is feasible, even if they don't want to do it. Is it actually possible? Then you write it as such. And then lastly, the kind of variable S, right? Sustainable. The action should be captured programmatically, has reminders if it's human performance related, and has controls such that it cannot be unintentionally removed. This could also be considered resilient. Is the action resilient to changes organizationally and leadership? Is it resilient against human performance realities? Those kind of things. Now, on the opposite side, we said we'd talk about it, right? Stupid corrective actions. So they are superficial, theoretical, unachievable, perpetual, irrational, or difficult. And difficult does not mean complex. A lot of corrective actions are complex or complicated matters. Difficult is more a situation if you're prescribing a corrective action that is difficult to achieve. Most often, it's because it's not going to work. So if you have a situation like this, meme here is like training, probably not going to work. So it's difficult to say the corrective action will be successful in that domain. But, and I'm sure we can all experience, go back into our life and see examples of both good corrective actions and bad corrective actions. And here's some other examples about sustainability. Remember, this also, if it helps, can be viewed as like a resilient style thing. But design changes that completely eliminate the failure mechanism, very sustainable. Changes to programs or processes, typically sustainable, especially if they're made in a domain where procedure use and adherence is an important benchmark. Any written performance expectations and a document, guideline, or policy that works both because when people write things down and they put effort into it, they tend to care that other people follow it. But on the other side, from an organizational perspective, right, if you wrote something, that could be evidence. So organizations tend to be pretty serious about their written processes. New and increased frequency of preventative maintenance. Not necessarily prescribing specific maintenance tasks, because those can still be avoided or pushed or whatever, but just some kind of baseline generalized, we're going to look at this thing every so often, period. Right? Those tend to be a little bit more resilient to organizational changes. And then I know I said training sometimes doesn't work, right? But recurring training and qualification is the kind of gold standard of that training domain, right? You want to make sure that people are staying engaged in their craft in such a way that makes them kind of reflect and deploy some of those kind of self-analysis. This is why, a lot of licensed professions have continuing education. Now, some examples of actions that don't have long-term sustainability. Single shots of trainings or single incidents of, communication from leadership, etc. One-time communications, reinforcements, counseling. And this is not to mean like clinical mental health counseling. This is like employee counseling, usually an HR type thing. And then repair or like-for-like replacement of a failed component, right? If a component failed, there's a reason why it failed, and the corrective action should deal with that. And sometimes you are replacing the failed component, but if that's all you're doing, that's not sustainable, right? Because the component failed for some other secondary reason or had a contributing cause that you need to analyze and capture in your plan. All right, everyone. So sorry if there's a hitch in the video there. I had a power outage happen. So for corrective action effects, right, the effect of a corrective action should be one of these three. It either eliminates the causes of the significant event so that the same or similar events are not repeated, mitigate the consequences of a repeat event, or significantly reduce the probability of occurrence of similar events of lower significance. So just kind of be aware as you're looking at corrective actions and assessing those, especially if you're looking at events after the fact and analyzing, okay, did the corrective actions, could they have actually achieved these goals? And then kind of the final thing just be aware of, right? There's a saying sometimes that'll go around that procedures or policies or regulations are written in blood, which sounds very dramatic, but really just means there's a reason we have those things, and it is because people have gotten hurt or there's been some kind of event or injury or damage. So laws are another example, right? Laws are corrective actions. So our warning labels, regulations, most signs that you'll ever see, right? And these are just some examples, right, of kind of silly examples, but also relatively effective corrective actions, right, in terms of what behavior they're trying to guide and to control. And that's really what we're looking at with corrective actions, is we're trying to, on the front end, design a process such that somebody can undertake it successfully. But also, if not, right, we want to try to shape and mold that behavior into a safe way. And that's all for this. Thanks.